Hello and welcome. This is now another interview for Fellowship of the Golden Age, and with me I have Tom Michalek, and anyone who is a transcriber would know that Tom is our wonderful whip cracker who keeps us all going. So hi Tom, how are you going?
Oh, nice to be here.
Yeah. Awesome. And also, yeah, could you just tell us just quickly a little bit about when and how and why and everything you ended up taking on the job of
Well, I'm not exactly sure how I became a transcriber, but probably 10 years ago, somehow Paul Vella, I got connected with him, and he asked me to be a transcriber, and or somebody mentioned it to me. I really don't recall how it. So for years, I transcribed for him. He was the coordinator at that time, and in those days we didn't use any. It was all manual transcription, and I type about 40 words a minute. So I'd have to slow the speed down. I found an app where I could slow the speed down to 40, and even then I'd be stopping it all the time. But now we use automated transcription, free automated. It's actually artificial intelligence, and it really does an excellent job. So now we start with a pretty good draft. So we're not starting from square one. So now when we send them out, we're starting with a very accurate draft, and it's more not transcribing, it's more editing. So we do a couple of iterations of editing and send it on to Yulita and Kim.
Yeah. It's not too hard because I do some transcribing, and it's pretty easy. There's just certain words that it doesn't quite know, but mostly it's everything right. So yeah. Anyway, thank you for what you do. Okay. So would you open up by telling us a little bit about describing what is a separate self?
Okay, when I think of a separate self, I have to start, and I've answered this or talked about this quite a bit on Reddit. I like to use Reddit. It's a good way of expressing my Christ self to others. And I always start with not with the separate self, but with the conscious you. I start with who I am. And as I see it, again, everything I'm going to say is my assimilation of all the teachings that I've gotten from the Ascended Masters. But I see myself as the conscious you, as an extension of my I am presence. I'm pure consciousness. I don't have any relative dualistic judgments on what's happening. I just see it. So when somebody would say something to me that's very would be hurtful to most people, my conscious self just sees it as words. This is what the person says. There's no judgment on it. But then, so that's the pure self that I am. And as spirit, and this helps me a lot too. It has helped me over the years. I'll probably talk about this later, but I started out as a Catholic, so I used to read the scriptures quite a bit. And one thing that always stuck with me was the fruit of the Spirit, and I really connected with that. And I said that makes sense. And it's love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. That's what spirit is. That's the fruit. That's how spirit, I, you, and all of us, when we are identified with spirit, that's what we manifest and that's what we experience. So anything less than that, we're not identified with spirit. So then now we talk about the separate self. Is when I first embodied, probably a long time ago, like all of us, I came as a conscious you. I didn't understand or couldn't relate to the violence that I saw. I couldn't, I probably expressed myself however I expressed myself, and I probably was either ridiculed or maybe, even physically harmed, and I didn't know how to deal with that. And so I had to create a persona, because I had the thought, again, from the masters that makes sense to me, is I never want to experience this again. What can I do to never experience this again? So I created a persona to deal with it. And because it's based on fear, it's the reactive self that I created the reactive separate self that I created is based on fear. So my reaction is going to be fight, flight, or stay in place, freeze. And so I've created these cells, and then to justify one self, I had to create other cells, and it just over time it created a huge conglomerate of cells that create altogether comprise my ego, my separate self. And the key, for me, is that if I start with my conscious self, I can step away from that. I can look at it and say, that person that responded, however I just did, which I might have regretted, that's not me. But as long as I don't recognize that conscious self, that's why I start with that. If I don't understand it, don't recognize that, don't have any identification with the more self, the conscious self that I am, I can't step away. I identify, because I'm completely identified with that separate self. But when I am identified with the conscious self, with the spirit, I can look at it, I can look what's behind it, and it's always just illusions and limited beliefs. And for me, a lot of times just ridiculous expectations. Sometimes when I look at the separate selves, when I see myself reacting, and I look at what I was expecting, that when I didn't get the reaction that I was expecting, I was so, put out. I see that the expectation was so ridiculous. I laugh out loud at myself at how silly I was. And I'm getting upset about this silly expectation of other people. And so I don't know if that answers it completely enough, or that's how I see the separate self.
Yeah, that's a really, really good explanation. Thanks, Tom. And so can you add on to that just to give maybe, an example or two of a separate self, like something that people could relate to, like one that you've let die?
Yeah, I think probably one that everybody could relate to if you drive is, I get behind somebody that's driving too slowly.
It's maybe I drive too slow.
It's 65 miles an hour, and it's a 2-lane road. I can't go anywhere, and somebody's driving 40 miles an hour in front of me, and I find myself reacting, sometimes cursing, even though I've been an ascended master all these years. It doesn't happen as often, but I still slip. I have to admit it. And then I stop and think, that's a separate self. That's not me. That's not love, joy, and peace. And so what am I expecting? I'm expecting that everybody should drive at the speed limit and never vary from that, and then I ask myself, well, have I ever done what they've done? Have I ever, maybe something bad happened? I'm worried about a relative. I'm worried about my dog being sick or whatever, or my own health. And you're not paying attention. And I slow down, pretty far below the speed limit. Oh yeah, I have, but that was a special, these people probably do it all the time. I only did it that once or twice, and so when you look at, so what am I expecting? I'm expecting that everybody should always, without exception, go the speed that they are that's according to the speed limit sign. And what really helps me the most is when motivates me to go after these separate selves is when I realize, okay, am I willing to let other people, people are people, they're going to do what they're going to do. There is no way that I can force them. This is going to happen again and again. So am I willing to go into a state of, look at myself, I'm upset, I'm cursing, I'm sending out this negative energy. I've allowed the situation to define me. I'm love, joy, and peace. And I've allowed, so I ask myself, are you willing to allow yourself to be defined by circumstances like that, as silly as that is? And if you are, you're going to be unhappy all your life, because there's going to be constant situations, whether it's, driving or other situations where people don't do as you think they should do. And am I willing to let that define me? And that motivates me. No, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And that motivates me to go after and look deeper into it and see the illusions and let them go.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good example and a very relatable one. And I'll just follow up by saying that, like, I live in a small size bus and everything, so it's like 4.5 ton. So she goes slower, like she just will not go as fast as everybody else. She's a bit older as well, and so yeah, I'm really aware always of people sort of behind me and everything, and I do pull over and let them pass. But sometimes I get that inevitable reaction where people just get really, really angry. But it's really helped because I've actually got a sticker, a big sort of sticker of Jesus on the back. So I think it's sort of just, people sort of see that and they're like, oh, okay, yeah. It reminds them, like,
Yeah,
don't get.
yeah, that's a good idea. That was brilliant.
Yeah, it's actually, yeah, that's got a bit dirty. It's time for a new one. You're just reminding me, like, put another Jesus one there and we'll be good. So yeah, so Tom, so can you just move on and also just tell us a bit about your life, like your journey. Like, I'd love to just hear about where you've been and yeah, the whole of it.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Chicago, which is at least the area that I grew up in the city on the south side of Chicago. It was very Catholic, and all my relatives, all my friends were Catholic. I went to a Catholic grade school for 8 years. At that time, way back then, this will give away my age. I'm going to be 76, so it's a long time ago. But there were still nuns back then. So most of my teachers were nuns. Went to mass at least twice a week. I was an altar boy, so I would go to mass, every day, at least, for a week, sometimes 2 or 3 weeks a month, and had religion catechism classes, as they called it, every day. So I was totally indoctrinated. They taught us that the Catholic Church was really the only religion, the only true religion. That's the way they stated it. And I was always curious. I was always asking questions of the nuns of, things that were confusing. Like I remember the 5th grade was the first time I remembered, but I still remember it vividly. I even remember where I was sitting, and the Sister Mario was talking about the Garden of Eden and the fall of man. And I raised my hand and I said, "Sister, you mean that if Adam and Eve hadn't eaten the apple, that we'd all still be in the Garden of Eden and paradise? There'd be no war, no sickness, no death, no." And she said, "Yes, that's right." And I sat down and I thought, that can't be right. And that kind of started my questioning and I increased my questions as time went on. So I'd ask questions of the priest. I even would kind of interview parishioners that were extremely devout, and not to put them on the spot or not because I was trying, but I was trying to understand what motivated them, because I was still a believer, but I just wanted to understand, why did they believe so much? And it all came down to a fear of hell with everybody that, all the lay people that I talked to. They were motivated by a fear of hell. And so as time went on, by the time I was 18, I thought, well, if the Catholic Church says that they're the only true religion, and I can't imagine why there would be any other religion, any Christian religion that would be more believable than them, and that they don't have any answers to life, and because I always had a feeling there was more, but I couldn't get that from them.
Yeah.
And their explanations always seem to contradict themselves, and so at 18 I finally just thought, well, I guess there's not a God. At least I'm not going to base my life on a belief that there is one, when there just doesn't seem to be any reason to believe it. So for the next 20 years I was an agnostic, and maybe even when I explain it to people or write it, I say agnostic / atheist, because I was pretty deep into scientific materialism, Dr. Carl Sagan. I read all his books, and I thought, yeah, that's real, that's true, and that went on for 20 years, and then finally, I had a kind of a little bit of awakening, and I just thought, well, if either the atheist is right or the believers are right, but as an agnostic, I can't be right. It's one or the other. Either there is a spiritual life, maybe it's not the God in the sky that the Christians teach, but there's maybe something beyond materialism, but either they're right or the atheists are right. But I realized, it dawned on me, I was a believer in indecision. And that just stuck in my throat. I thought, yeah, that I don't identify with that. I see myself as decisive. I see that, I can make up my mind. And so I determined I will make up my mind. I will figure this out and decide one way or the other. I didn't set a time frame on it, but I spent roughly a year. And basically, I didn't, I had already looked at religion so long, I didn't really need to look at it again. But I started questioning the assumptions of scientific materialism that I never questioned before. And, things like abiogenesis, the creation of the first cell without any, just, simultaneous creation of the first cell where all of the chemicals came together just right, and you had a reproducing cell. And I found, credible people like I think it was Francis Crick that was one of the discoverers of DNA, and he said something like it's reasonable in order to believe in abiogenesis, it would be almost a miracle with the current knowledge that we have. In other words, we just may not be able to explain it right now, but as we understand it right now, it's kind of a miracle. And then the one that really got me was there was a Fred Hoyle, or I guess Dr. Fred Hoyle, who was an astronomer, well-known astronomer at the time. And he had, and you could find this on the internet, but he described it as the first cell just simultaneously coming together with no outside influence. He said it would be like a tornado hitting a junkyard, and after the tornado passed, you look and there's a 747 aircraft sitting there, complete, intact, functional.
Yep.
It's that fantastic that it could have just happened. There's so many things that would have had to come together simultaneously, all at once, and so those kind of, and then I guess the last thing that really convinced me was when I looked at the fact that the universe is expanding, and it's not only expanding but it's accelerating, and so that requires energy. Well, where's the energy coming from? It has to be coming from outside. Well, it's not going to come from another universe, if there is another universe. There has to be something beyond the material universe. So that, at that point, I was just kind of stumped. And then finally, I was on my way to work, on my commute to work. It was a dark, cold morning. And I was driving along, and it dawned on me all of a sudden, I'm never going to figure this out. I'm never going to be able to convince myself that either this is right or that's right. I'm stuck. And then I hadn't thought about it. I didn't think about it. But the words came out of my mouth out of just frustration. And I did feel a sense of surrender, like there's nothing else I can do. I've done everything I can to figure it out. And I said, God, if you're real, I'm willing to listen. And immediately, with no pause or delay, I felt a wave of energy is the way I'd have to describe it. But it not only flooded over me, but it passed through me. And it lasted a while. I don't know how long. It seemed like a long time. But the feeling was warm and love and a joy that is indescribable. And I was one of those, raised in my time, big boys don't cry, men don't cry. I was driving to work with tears continuously streaming down my face, not an alligator tear here and there, but just streaming. I'm wiping myself it's dripping off of me. And at that point, I wasn't, I didn't, my consciousness wasn't changed. I wasn't enlightened or anything like that. I was still exactly where I was, except now I was open. And it was, I think about what the masters say, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Yeah. But at that point, I wasn't a believer. I experienced the reality. There is something beyond the material world. I knew it. There was no convincing. I was a follower. I was no longer, I didn't need to be a believer because I experienced the reality of a spirit, something spiritual, whatever it was, and I didn't know what it was. And then I just listened to kind of the insights that I got. Actually, the first insight I got was read Proverbs. And I at the time I was a very linear thinking kind of person. In fact, in my earlier years, I used to mock anybody who talked about instincts or anything that wasn't a linear thought process. And I think I was led to Proverbs because it is kind of logical. It does have a logical. It's not all that mystical. It kind of builds on itself. It appeals to the linear mind. At least it appealed to my linear mind. And from that point, to shorten it a little bit, I felt compelled to move to other books, like Selves, I think was next, and then I think the Gospels, and then I just started looking at other books outside. I would go to a bookstore. My wife and kids would go to whenever we'd go to the mall. My wife and kids would go to shop for clothes or whatever they had to do, and I'd go to the bookstore, and I would go mostly in self-help areas and then in spiritual areas, and whatever vibrated with me. Whatever resonated with me, I would choose that book. Many of them I wouldn't recommend to anybody now, but it was what I needed at the time to just open me to the next level, and so forth and so on. And so that continued, and then I guess it was maybe probably about 20 years ago, I found a website or a movement called what was it? Can't think of it now. Pathworks, and it was they were messages, spiritual messages given through a woman by the name of Eva Pierrakos, and they were very much like the teachings from the Ascended Masters. And I read them multiple times. They were very much focused on the ego, and I got a lot out of those. Finally, I was led to a book, or felt inspired to, when my book search through a bookstore, there was a book on spiritual laws, like the law of cause and effect, the law of multiplication, and those kind of things. So I read that book, and then it occurred to me that, so in my lunchtime at work on my computer in my office, I would Google, spiritual stuff. And it occurred to me one day that if these spiritual laws existed, and it made so much sense, because they were kind of self-evident. This is really what happens, as you do, as you give, so shall you receive. That does happen. And as you as you use your talents, in the U.S. anyway, it's use it or lose it. If you multiply what you have, you get more. So it is self-evident to most people. So I thought, well, if these laws are reality, if this is how it really works, and it looks like it surely is, then Jesus must have taught this. This must have been at the core. But I used to read the Gospels a lot, because I always had a sense when I was a Christian, when I was a young boy, going to church all the time, I'd read the Gospels and had a sense there's something here, but it never seemed to apply to me because I was already, all I had to do according to the church was follow the church's rules. I didn't need to try to make sense of what Jesus was teaching. So they, but not so. I had that thought that if the laws are real and they seem to be, then Jesus must have taught them. And so then I did a search, and it didn't take long before I found the Ask Real Jesus website. A couple of clicks after that, and I was on the Ask Real Jesus website. And I thought, well, this is a little bit fantastic that, people ask questions and Jesus answers. My eyebrow went up, my skeptical eyebrow went up. But as soon as I read a couple of discourses, it was, and I had a lot to compare to. This was so far above and beyond, yet it was so clear and easy to understand. And a lot of the stuff that I had read recently was, seemed very enlightened, but sometimes I'd have to read it 3 times to understand what it meant. But this was so clear. The answers from Jesus were so clear, yet so profound at the same time. It was like, this is it. And that was 17 years ago, just about 17 years ago in December, about right now, is when I discovered the Ask Real Jesus website.
Wow. And it's amazing. If I can say there's one thing that every single one of us seems to have in common is that moment when we first came across the Ask Real Jesus website or wherever it is we landed, and just this instant moment of recognition. I'm home. I don't need to search anymore. And how lucky are we? This is the other thing that I just sort of think is amazing. How lucky are we to have such an incredible abundance of teachings that it's like endless almost. It's almost infinite what we've got access to. Yeah.
That's what's so unique. I agree, because even when I found other teaching, there were times when I thought, oh, now I found it. This is really good. But there was maybe 3 books by a certain author, and then it was, oh, now what do I do? And then so I would be on the search again. Where here it's constant, revelations after revelation, progressive revelations. And it is a blessing. I think about it. It's at the top of my list. Sometimes at 76, I naturally have got a little collection of physical issues, that I've got to deal with, and pains in the back and this and that. But I find that it's helpful. I walk my dog a couple of times a day. So the first thing in the morning, I walk my dog and it's quiet. And I find it helpful to count my blessings. And the number one thing that I'm grateful for is the teachings. I've got the teachings, and then, my wife, my dog, my health, my, freedom. But the teachings are such a blessing. Yeah.
And also what sort of I just find amazing is I often think, like, how can the masters sort of keep coming up with, like, it's kind of similar, the message, but then, you just get this slightly different angle or a slightly different view, and you think, oh, maybe if you're looking at with a really linear outer mind, it seems like it's at a superficial level, it's the same thing, but there's always something new. It's new each time. Like,
it's remarkable. I don't know, every conference, before every conference, I look at the subject and I think to myself, I have no idea what they could possibly say about that more than what they've already said. But I know from experience they're going to have a lot to say about it, and it's going to be profound, and it's going to be very helpful.
Yeah. So anyway, I think it's remarkable. So what I'd like it if you could talk a little bit about the primal self and what your understanding of it is and where you're at with processing the primal self. I'd like to hear that.
Okay. I think the primal self, if I recall right, is the initial self that we created when we first embodied, the very first embodiment, the first shell that we put on that wasn't real, and then everything emanated from that. And I think I've done, I don't know how many times I've done it, probably at least 33 times. Mother Mary's visualization, where you go through the 7 gardens.
Yeah.
And and as I did so, I didn't really have any view of anything specific happening to me. But what did help me is, and it just came kind of little insights, came reminders of things that I've noticed about myself that I kind of have been always kind of pushy. I think that I have answers. I don't feel conceited, but I see people suffering. I see people worrying about things, and I've always, from way before I ever found the masters, I've always tried to counsel them. But there was always a little element of push, is, can't you see this? Come on, And so I think that I came with, and the masters have talked that a lot of us had this, I came with a fundamental lack of respect for free will. And when I expressed that, I think, I probably it was probably reacted with poorly. People don't want to be told. I mean, one of the ways I discovered this, and I don't want to get into too many stories, but this might be interesting, is probably 10 years ago, we were just inundated. I don't live in a small town. It's like a suburb. I don't know, maybe 80,000, 60,000, something like that. I haven't looked at our population for a while. But the street that I live on, we had constant noise from loud exhausts from Harley Davidsons, where people had taken their mufflers off.
Yeah.
And trucks that have had their exhaust systems modified, and cars of teenagers where they've modified their exhaust systems or removed them, and it was just this constant roar. So I'll try to make this short. I got involved. I created a citizen action committee, met with the alderman, got his sponsorship. I researched a paper on noise and noise pollution, the fact that noise is not allowed by federal law, state law, and city law, and that the city. And we met with the alderman and the mayor and everybody else, the police chief. And to make a long story short, we failed. It didn't go through. They didn't want to tick off their voters. And so after having gone through this, one day I was sitting in a parking lot waiting for my wife. She was shopping, and this real loud, obnoxiously loud car went by, and I caught myself reacting, and again, I thought, okay, what am I expecting? Well, he shouldn't do that. He should be considerate. Well, there's 8 billion people on this planet. Are you willing to allow them to define you when some of them aren't considerate? Well, the city should enforce the laws. Well, they have free will too. And so I thought, I'm not respecting free will, and I'm suffering myself because I haven't respected free will. So I've done everything I could, which could have had an effect, but didn't. So I accept it now. The second example would be my wife. We have a very good relationship, but we used to have arguments, not so much because of her, but because of me, because I was trying to convince her, and there was always that push. And so I think part of my primal self is related, or my primal self is related to that disrespect that I had initially for free will. And so there would be some force, even if it might be subtle, even if my maybe feeble attempts to, not be too pushy, because I know people aren't going to do that, but there'd be a little bit, there in the background. And when I discovered that, and I just surrendered it and said, and because of the masters, of course, for like example with my wife, I would not just close up and not share with her, but I would say, I'm not telling you what to do. I respect your free will, but here's a way you might look at it. And in my heart, I had absolute surrender. Here it is. I'm offering it to you. You can mock it. You can do whatever you want with it or use it, whatever you want. It's up to you. And then she was instead of reacting to me, which is what normal would do, she was listening. And so she was helped. And she would tell you that the masters have helped her through me since I've made that change, but only until I made that change. Up till then, she saw it as force that I'm pushing.
Yeah.
So I think that's my primal self. My primal self is one that was created with a lack of respect to free will, and then because of that, other people reacted, and because of that, I had to create other selves to protect myself from them.
And in a way, it's such a subtle nuance, isn't it? Like just we're not aware of it when it's happening, but that nuance of like that energy of the force that comes through. But then once we realize that's what's been there and we let that go, it's just a dropping away, really. It's not really, you don't have to do anything active. You just release that force.
No, less.
And,
yeah.
And it sets others free, and it sets you free as well. Yeah. It's very, very subtle and nuanced, but so powerful. Like it's life-changing, absolutely life-changing. Okay, Tom. Well, we've pretty much hit the point of time to say goodbye and wrap it up. Okay. So it's really, really interesting to listen to you today and to your story and yet another wonderful aspect of the whole of this is the other thing that just amazes me with each person I meet and connect with is that the incredible diversity that we are and of our divine plans too, like how each one of us, has this very, very specific divine plan that we follow through, and it's lovely to bring these stories through which show that. So thank you for sharing yours.
Thank you for what you do to allow me to share this and the other people who have contributed to share their stories.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, and more to come, of course. So, all
Very
right.
Good.
Okay, Tom, lovely talking, and farewell to our viewers. Bye-bye.
Bye.